Some of the best video games ever made are based on licensed properties. It's a simple process. You just make a really good game based on something that's already popular, and gamers will love it even more as a result. Unfortunately, sometimes developers just skip the whole making a good game part of this equation, which, call me crazy, I'd say is the most important thing. As a result, games based on licensed properties are a bit of a hit or miss proposition with a lot more misses than hits. But when they do hit, boy howdy, it can be magic. And when they don't, it can be frustrating and annoying to say the least. Here's the problem. It's borderline predatory to make a crappy game based on something people love. You're taking advantage of people's pre-established fandom for the intellectual property without actually earning it with a well-made game. And yes, it was even worse back in the day because we had less coverage of games, without the internet, to warn us if they were bad or not. It was a lot more common to purchase a game without knowing much about it. I mean, just think about how many kids got swindled and fleeced back in the day by a Back to the Future or, goodness forbid, Superman 64. And like we talk about all the time on this channel, a lot of kids didn't get very many games back in the day, making the burning pain of disappointment even worse. But hey, you didn't know any better, and your parents weren't going to be the ones to save you from it either. Heck, they probably were more likely to buy you one of those games as a gift just out of relief to find a game based on something they'd actually heard of before and knew you liked. Oh, my little Sammy loves Superman. I'll be the hero of the holidays with this banger of a gift. Swing and a miss. I tell ya, but with all this potential for things to go horribly wrong, there is still a silver lining, which is of course the good games based on licensed properties. These games are special because they were a novelty for a multitude of reasons. Reason number one, just a game being good in general is kind of a novelty, right? Reason number two, being a good game based on something you like was amazing. And reason number three, having your fandom respected instead of taken advantage of like it could have been for so many other licensed games was such a relief. Okay, so what did these good games have in common? What were some of the telltale signs? Well, the same way you can have a good idea if any game is good or not. Look at who developed the game. Heck, Capcom nearly single-handedly saved a bunch of Disney fans from getting totally screwed during the 8 and 16-bit generations, although Sega did help out as well. But anyways, most Capcom games during this time were at least reasonably good, if not great, and the fact they were making games based on Disney properties didn't stop that. Really, when you think about it, it's pretty easy to understand. When a game is made by a subpar developer, they don't just magically become a great developer because they have favorable subject matter to use. Like, just because I'm listening to Michael Jackson isn't going to make me a better dancer. Getting to work with a fun intellectual property can provide some inspiration, but inspiration only goes so far. For a game based on a licensed property to be good, it needs to be made by a team that knows what they're doing. Funny enough, a lot of the success stories are games that take a lot of creative liberties with the subject material they're based on. And for the most part, gamers are okay with that so long as the game is good. Remember all the parkour wall jumping Batman does in the Tim Burton movie? No? Well, who cares, because it makes for an awesome video game. Gamers just want to do something fun as Batman. And sure, the technical limitations are going to play a role with later generations being able to recreate their source material in a more realistic way. But honestly, I almost think that makes it more impressive what developers with more limited technology were able to pull off. They basically had to build a great game from the ground up that could stand on its own regardless of the licensed property tie-in. And in some cases, it resulted in some of the most iconic gameplay mechanics that were ever created. Just look at the pogo mechanic in DuckTales. Who would have ever thought that a character that can be described as old and has a cane could be fun to control? Just have him bounce around on his cane like a complete madman. Easily one of the most fun and memorable game mechanics. Regardless of how closely it followed the source material, these developers would use the subject matter in fun ways. After all, that's what talented people who know what they're doing tend to do. Of course, some games would follow the source material a little more closely. If we transition from Batman by Sunsoft on NES to Batman Returns by Konami on Super NES, we get a game that follows the movie more closely. In fact, while we're talking about Konami, we gotta give them some credit. After all, they were the people who delivered darn near every kid at the time's wildest dream, a Ninja Turtles game that, if you allow me to be dorky for just a second, kicked shell. And not only did they put it out in arcades, they did a great job bringing it to home consoles as well. This game was less about coming up with something new and innovative, and more about being the culmination of everything gamers had wanted. Beat-em-ups were a very safe bet and well liked, and while this one was handled exceptionally well, the main thing it delivered was a Ninja Turtles game that allowed you to play as all the different turtles and fight against all the bad guys we'd gotten to know from the show. That's all we wanted, and it was delivered in such a spectacular way. Perhaps one of the other more notable video games based off a licensed property would be Goldeneye 007, and in particular because it could be argued that the game ended up being even more popular than the movie that it was based off of. James Bond was popular, sure, but probably more so with people who were older than the typical N64 playing crowd. I mean, I don't remember a lot of kids doing James Bond impressions back then. Personally, playing this game is what got me to care about James Bond in the first place. I didn't even know about the movie until after I had already been playing the game for a long time. I remember watching the movie and thought it was fun to see how the movie closely followed the game, rather than the other way around. Another interesting example of a licensed game would be Die Hard Arcade. In Japan, this game is called Dynamite Deca, but because it's so obviously influenced by the Die Hard movie, they just called it Die Hard Arcade here in the States since it would be marketable. And now we get to the X-Men stuff, which was a big deal. X-Men was huge in the 90s, not that it isn't now, and gamers were treated to quite a few well-done X-Men games. There were some console games of varying quality. X-Men 2 on the Genesis is typically considered one of the better ones. There was the arcade game by Konami that became famous for its ability to let you play 6 players all at once, huddled around a giant, and I mean giant, arcade cabinet. Seriously, how did they move these things? Forklifts? And then of course we eventually got the crossover X-Men games that combined Street Fighter with X-Men. A brilliant idea which would go on to form the Marvel vs. Capcom series. Instead of making a video game based off a beloved licensed property, we get a licensed property added into an already well-established video game franchise, and one as popular as Street Fighter at that. So there we have it. Games based on licensed properties are a double-edged sword. They can either be great for making our ultimate dreams come true, or incredibly disappointing and malicious for taking advantage of our fandom. For this video's question, you probably already know where I'm going with it, and yes, I'd like to hear what your favorite licensed game is. But the second part of my question is even more fun, being what is a licensed game that you were burned by as a kid? That's right, I want to hear all about the pain and heartache you experienced. So be sure to leave those comments as always, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the red bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games.